Civil disobedience. When is it acceptable for Christians? Like me, you may be observing what seems to be an ever-increasing authoritarianism around the world, and every day it seems to grow more unreasonable and, in many cases, apparently politically motivated. And of course, it all surrounds policies regarding the current COVID pandemic. And we're watching people in our nation and, of course, in other nations around the world lose not only their freedoms, but in some cases, it seems, their lawfully given, constitutionally given rights as citizens. And so the question is being asked. People are beginning to wonder, when do we say no? When do we rebel? When do we have the right to disobey what the government is telling us that we ought to do? Well, of course, as Christians, we know that, generally speaking, we're supposed to be the absolute best citizens of our countries as far as submitting to the government is concerned. And I can think of at least 3 places in the New Testament where that point is made very clear. Twice by the Apostle Paul and once by the Apostle Peter. We're supposed to obey the authorities. And perhaps the most classic passage on this subject is found in Paul's letter to the Romans. And if you're very familiar with Romans, you know that in chapter 13, he directly addresses it. And so let's read the first 7 verses of Romans chapter 13 and then explore this subject a little bit more deeply by considering other scriptures that might bring a balance to what Paul writes in Romans 13. All right? So Paul said, "Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance or the authority of God, and they who oppose will receive condemnation upon themselves." So Paul makes rebellion against the government tantamount to rebelling against God. That's pretty sobering, isn't it? And the logic behind that is because all authority stems from God. Nobody has authority unless God, we would say, gave it to them, or we could say granted it to them. Either way, they wouldn't have it unless God gave it to them. Remember when Pilate said to Jesus, he was so shocked that Jesus would not answer him, and the accusations that were being made against him. And he said, "Don't you know that I have authority over you to release you or condemn you?" And Jesus said, "You would have no authority over me at all, except it had been given to you by God." So here's a guy, Pilate, who's not a good guy, right? Not a good guy at all. And yet Jesus is acknowledging that God, and he could have said himself, because he was and is God, gave him his authority. That doesn't mean that God approved of him, that God gave him a stamp of righteousness, just that, God could remove Pilate just by the clicking of his fingers, and Pilate would be history. He'd be deposed or dead or something. And so anybody who's in power, at bare minimum, in a government, has that power, that authority, by God's permission. And it's very difficult, of course, for us to say without kind of gritting our teeth that God gave them their authority. I mean, that's kind of what Paul seems to be saying here. There is no authority except from God, and those which exist, now listen to this very strong verb, are established by God. Okay, and the only way I can soften that is to say, well, that would include, of course, God allowing people to have power, because we know that some people come to power by very unethical means. Back in Paul's day, it could have been by war and conquest and so forth, or coups. and that still happens today around the world, or by cheating in elections and illegitimate elections and so forth. And so, we just hate to think that God established people who didn't get their authority ethically or morally, but rather unethically. But nevertheless, we have to rest in the sovereignty of God, that although they may have not acquired their position ethically, God didn't prevent it. God allowed it. Okay, now you say, why would God ever allow a wicked person to a governing position? Well, there are a number of reasons, I suppose. The first one that comes to mind is that he's judging the people whom that authority person, that governing person, is over. And so God sometimes judges wicked people by giving them wicked leaders. Right? And there could be other reasons. God is also a God who tests us. And in order to be tested, you have to be placed in an environment in which you have to make a decision, right? And an environment in which you're tempted to do wrong. Well, who hasn't been tempted to disobey the law, particularly when we feel we have moral justification to disobey the law? That's a tough one. In any case, Paul doesn't back down at all in this passage. He said, "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil." Now, you could say, well, wait a second. Sometimes the rulers are evil and they're telling, their subjects to do evil things along with them. Yes. And nobody can argue that, and I don't believe that Paul would have argued against that. In fact, we're going to, delve into his theology a little bit deeper here beyond just Romans 13. Nevertheless, generally speaking, even the worst of governments have some, even if it's slight or small, some redeeming factor, within their governance, that they are punishing the bad guys and they are rewarding the good guys. Okay, they're trying to encourage civil behavior in order to keep peace within their populations and so forth. And so they determine how tax money is spent and certain crimes. You can't steal, you can't murder, generally speaking, and under most governments. Even though they might be murdering on the side through their agencies or stealing, through wrongful taxation and so forth. Okay, so this is generally true what Paul says here, but we of course know that it isn't 100% true. So Paul writes then, in keeping with that same theme, do you want to have no fear of authority? Well, yeah, it's a rhetorical question, right? I don't want to have any fear of authority. Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. I remember one time years ago when I was a pastor, and I took a vacation to Florida. We live in Pennsylvania, so it's good, I think 1,200 miles to the southern Florida from Pennsylvania. And that was back in the day when most of the speed limits were 55 miles an hour. And I want to tell you, 55 miles an hour on an interstate highway, a 4-lane divided interstate highway, seems mighty, mighty slow. It's like a snail's pace. And the justification for it was at that time, was to conserve fuel because of the oil crisis and so on. Nowadays, of course, many roads, I was driving on a road not too long ago where the speed limit was 80 miles an hour. That was over in Oklahoma. And then I think they have those kind of highways in Texas as well, and other places out west. So, but 55, oh my goodness. And so everybody, of course, is tempted to go over 55 miles an hour. And, the police are waiting to catch speeders. And I remember I announced to my congregation, I said, I discovered a way that you could drive all the way to Florida and not have to worry about getting a speeding ticket, And everyone thought I was going to talk about some new device, which you could buy them at the time. I'm sure you could probably still buy them, a device that detects police radar, so that as you're driving on the highway, if a policeman is aiming one of those radar guns at you to get to clock your speed, an alarm goes off in your car and you can immediately hit the brakes and save yourself a ticket. So I said, hey, guess what? I found a way you can drive all the way to Florida and you don't have to worry about getting a speeding ticket. And I left a little pause there for them to kind of anticipate what I was going to say next. And I said, here's the secret. Never drive over 55 miles an hour. And not saying that I did that, okay, but that's the truth. If you don't want to, be nailed as a lawbreaker, don't break the law, okay? Do you want to have no fear of authority? Paul says, do what is good and you'll have praise from the same. For it is, listen to this, for it is a minister of God to you for it is a minister of God to you for good. I think talking there about, we would say policemen, they would say back in those days, government soldiers and so forth. But then he goes on, but if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. And so no one can argue this. That's the reason God has established human governments, to establish order and justice in a group of people, in a society. And of course, we all hate it when that doesn't happen. But you have to admit that even in some of the worst governments, they have that at least to some degree. And of course, in Paul's day, there were some awful people in government. We read about the Herod, who, several Herods, of course, but the one Herod who had John put in prison and then beheaded. And again, he didn't have to take a vote on, didn't have to call anybody. There were no elected representatives. John had no say-so. He just cut off his head because just at a whim. He had that kind of unilateral power. Another Herod, I think the father of the guy who had John beheaded, if I'm not mistaken, just decided he wanted all the young boys who lived in Bethlehem and the environs around it under the age of 2 killed. And so dispatched soldiers, they go there and rip babies from their mothers, little boys, little toddlers from their mothers, and kill them. And so that's the kind of rulers that existed back in that day. Caesar was a very powerful guy, as were all the under rulers and so on. But still, they performed a necessary and actually beneficial service in general to the society at the time. Okay. So we go on here. Now we're already into verse number 5. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, although you don't to subject yourself just because you're fearful of the temporal consequences of the God-established authority, but also for conscience sake. So, we're trying to keep a clear conscience before God. God, I've submitted to you, and so, of course, I submit to the authorities that you have placed in my life. And I was born in this nation, and you put these people over me, and so I submit to them. I will not disobey them. And then Paul specifically touches on another little sore spot for many of us here. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God. I mean, he's really complimentary here, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And Jesus, again, endorsed that same idea himself. I think Paul maybe even borrowed the words when he said, render to all what is due them. Remember when they were testing Jesus and said, should we pay this tax? And he said, give me a coin. Whose inscription is on that coin? Caesar's. Well, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God's what is God's. So there is an obligation for God's people to pay their taxes, as much as we don't like some of the ways that they use our tax money. Now, can I follow a little rabbit trail here, very quickly? If you don't know what I'm doing there, if you ever watch Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd, okay, that's how Elmer Fudd talked. He was always chasing the wabbit. So I'm going to follow a rabbit trail here just for a minute, because some Christians would say that it's wrong for Christians to serve in government. Well, and of course, they didn't have that opportunity back in that day. This was no democracy. This was no republic. The Jews were ruled by the Roman occupiers. They had no say-so. There was no representation, but there was plenty of taxation. Okay, so to say though that no Christians should ever serve in government because government's an evil thing and no Christians should, get involved in that dirty politics and so forth. What? In light of Romans chapter 13, what? All the compliments that Paul gives regarding, rulers, they're ministers of God, they're servants of God, they're established by God. Oh my goodness. I actually would like to think that only Christians, only those who are submitted to God are really qualified to serve in government because they're submitted to God. And if they are, then they have their citizens' interests at heart, and they'll try to deal justly and righteously and do what's right and do righteousness rather than what is evil and lawless and unrighteous. Okay, so I applaud any Christian involved in politics, running for office, serving in office, those who are involved politically. That's one way to let your light shine. And I know that some Christians let it become their entire religion, but that doesn't mean, you should throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's an honorable thing to want to serve people as a minister of God in the political and governing realm of any jurisdiction. Okay? All right. So there you have it. There's the general word from the Apostle Paul: obey the governing authorities, and here's why. Now, is there ever a time when civil disobedience is acceptable and appropriate? Well, that answer is actually very, very simple. And that would simply be anytime the government steps over the line and requires of its citizens to do something that would violate their conscience, or we could say that would require that they disobey God. Because obviously, God doesn't want us to disobey him ever. And if we have a choice between disobeying, a human governmental authority, even if it's established by him or permitted by him, and disobeying God, God would prefer that we disobey the human government and be willing to suffer the consequences as well, as many brave and good and honorable people have done throughout the centuries. One of them, of course, the whole group were the apostles. Okay, the original 12 apostles, minus Judas, of course, he was replaced. But you can read a story there in Acts chapter 5. Remember when all the apostles were incarcerated by the order of the Sanhedrin, and they were released by an angel, to go and preach. I think it was during the night, and so they went out and started preaching again. And when the Sanhedrin assembled and sent the guards to go get the apostles, none of them were there. And they found them out preaching. And so they rounded them up and brought them before the Sanhedrin. And I'm going to just break into Acts chapter 5 and verse number 28. The high priest says to them, "We gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name," the name of Jesus, "and yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us." Poor guy. Verse 29, "But Peter and the apostles answered, 'We must obey God rather than men.'" And so there's a key scripture to remember that's relevant to this topic. Amen. We must obey God rather than men. So if we're given the choice between obeying one or the other, then you obey God. Well, I haven't yet been put in a position like that where the government has demanded that I disobey God. Okay, maybe you have. But, thankfully that in the country in which I live, we have freedom of speech. although it is being denied to some people, obviously. Folks are being censored like crazy, not by the government so much, but by, other groups that are aligned with them. And we have the freedom of a peaceful assembly, so we can have a forum there to demonstrate how we feel about things. And these are essential ingredients to a democracy or a republic, whatever you want to call us. And thank God for it. And those freedoms have not been lost entirely yet, but we certainly are becoming alarmed by the trend. Okay, but thankfully there's a process which that can be rectified. Things like elections. And thank God for everybody who's working in the realm of ensuring election integrity, because that's, of course, foundational. All right. So even the Apostle Paul, he didn't always go along with everything the government said. I'm thinking of a passage in later on in Acts, and let me turn to it here. I have it on the other side of my page. Thought it was better organized than this. But this, remember, was when Paul was in preaching the gospel in Philippi, divinely directed. They had wonderful success casting the demon out of this little demon-possessed girl. And some guys who were making money off her got upset and got a bunch of other people riled up and ginned up. And pretty soon, Paul and his traveling companion Silas find themselves, in jail. And they're singing praises to God at midnight. You know the story in Acts 6:16. And all of a sudden the foundations of the prison are shaken and everyone's chains fall off and all the doors open. And Paul hears the jailer's about to kill himself because he would have been executed anyways for allowing all the prisoners to escape. And Paul said, don't do yourself any harm. We're all here. And he leads the jailer to the Lord. And the jailer then takes him to his house and feeds him a meal. And the next morning they go back into prison. So there is Paul submitting to the authorities. The authorities put him in prison and he had a chance to get out of prison, but he went back to prison. So talk about civil obedience. Oh my goodness. He's civilly obedient to the max here. And what's interesting, we're breaking in now to the end of the story in Acts chapter 16 and verse number 35. Now, when day came, the chief magistrates sent their policemen, saying, release those men, Paul and Silas. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, the chief magistrates has sent to release you. Therefore, come out now and go in peace. This is when it gets funny. Paul said to them, they have beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans. So these magistrates have broken the law, and we could report them to their superiors and get them in big trouble. They have mistreated Roman citizens, and they have thrown us into prison, and now they are sending us away secretly? I love it. I love it. So Paul's not going along. He's not submitting, to be a partner and cover their crime. He's exposing their evil. See that? Again, he's still submitting, but he knows his rights as a Roman citizen, and he's demanding his rights as a Roman citizen. So he says, no, indeed, let them come themselves and bring us out. The policemen reported these words to the chief magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans, and they came and appealed to them. And so they came personally, so they're humbled by this whole thing. They have to apologize, admit that they've done wrong, and experienced the grace that Paul and Silas offered of forgiveness. They didn't press charges. They didn't, contact their superiors to report what had happened. And when they had brought them out, they kept begging them to leave the city. So they went out of the prison, entered the house of Lydda. She was the first convert in Philippi. When they saw the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. So there's a little bit of a balance there. And Paul's the one who wrote Romans 13, but look at his application here. Completely submissive, but yet, on the other hand, holding to his guns, holding to his rights. And there are other examples in the Bible, of course, of civil disobedience that God bless. Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children not bowing to the statue, and so, they were not going to bow to a statue. The Hebrew midwives, remember Pharaoh called them in and said, "Hey, when you deliver the babies of the people of Israel, when they're born, kill them." Oh, what a moron Pharaoh was to think that midwives, women who their job, their service is helping women have babies, that they're ever gonna kill them, those babies, after they help the mothers give birth. I mean, what was the guy thinking? It just shows power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You become a moron sometimes when you get so much power. You just think that you're God, and Pharaoh thought he was God, so he could just tell people, tell midwives, kill the babies that you're delivering. What an idiot. What a moron he became. And we see that, of course, in governmental leaders in modern day. They just become inebriated with their power, and they don't see themselves as servants of the people, as Paul described them in Romans 13. They see themselves as gods. And they're just going to give their dictates and their dictums, and then they get exposed. They don't even follow their own rules, which makes them utter hypocrites. And when they're confronted over it, they're not red-faced. They stammer a little bit, but you can tell they actually don't think they're under the rules that they apply to everybody else. They're morons, just like Pharaoh. And like Pharaoh, if they don't repent, they're going to regret it as well. Okay, all right. Well, that's enough for today's little lesson. I've droned on here. If you're still listening, thank you that you're still listening. If you've never been to our teaching website, which is davidservant.com, why don't you check us out? There's decades of content that we put there, all for your spiritual edification. And it's all free, okay? Books and articles and teachings and so on. Okay, until next time, may the Lord continue to bless you.